Hi, this is Tim Hamilton, the co-host of the Maryland Crabs, and I'm here with a crab cake for your listening pleasure. What's a crab cake? Well, it's not quite a full episode, it's just a little snippet. Stay tuned and check it out. Make sure you check us out on themarylandcrabs.com. You can follow us on Twitter at MD Crabs Podcast or find us on Facebook at the Maryland Crabs Podcast. Don't forget, subscribe, rate us, iTunes. Go there now.
Leslie and I were talking about Saturday morning cartoons the other day and talking about Speed Racer. Did you ever watch Speed Racer?
I'm Gen X, of course I watched it.
Yeah, like what was it, Captain Chesapeake?
We had Captain 20 because we were in DC.
Okay.
So you guys had Captain
We
Chesapeake
did.
On your UHF?
Yeah, it was, I think it was 45. But anyway, we're just talking about the storyline of Speed Racer, where every conflict is resolved through a race car chase.
Do you know what's like that? The 80s movies, every conflict is resolved through a sailboat race. One Crazy Summer. Summer Rental. And there's one other one, but they're all sailboat races.
There was the documentary about Dennis Conner winning the America's Cup. That was resolved by a sailboat race.
But that wasn't a funny movie with John Cusack.
Oh, okay.
And we're here with Josh Cohen, former mayor of Annapolis, breaking down local politics. We're continuing on with Maryland Podcast Month, which is brought to you by our friends at Red Maryland. All right, so you know what? Here's what I like about our friends of the podcast is that every podcast is now becoming a drinking podcast. So here we are on a Tuesday evening.
This is incredible.
I'm on Mr. Cohen's front porch in West Annapolis in the tail end of a storm. This is a beautiful house, and I love this porch. And I roll up, and we got a big old honking can of beer here.
This is a 750 milliliter can of beer.
I'm American, so I don't understand milliliters. It looks like a not a pint, like cup of. I can't. I guess we should go to metric system because I don't even know how to describe it.
No, a fifth is a.
It's a fifth of a liter.
Isn't that 750 ml?
I guess you're right. Yeah. So what's it called now?
Solarama Crush. So this is actually a nice lead into talking about podcasting.
Look at you with the segues. Yeah.
Because I did an interview with a guy named Rob Davis. He's the director of this Center for Pollinators and Energy, which is all about how you can incorporate pollinator habitat into solar farms. And so he gave me this, which I'm saving until this very moment. Solarama Crush. It is what we believe to be the nation's first solar honey craft IPA, an IPA brewed with honey from hives on a solar farm.
Wow, that is super specialized. All right, so we're going to open that up. I'm a gardening nerd, and so I actually do get into all that stuff. And actually, I'm looking over your shoulder here. You got a nice garden going on there. I see tomatoes and...
Thank you. That's my wife.
Beans. I thought your wife was in the kitchen. All right, so my glass, you have the Baltimore Ravens glass, and mine says Shalom Biatch. I'm not even Catholic anymore. Okay, oh man, that smells good. All right, cheers.
Cheers
to podcasting.
That's delicious.
Wow, that is good, huh?
So, just to give a plug to the brewery, it's called 56 Brewing. It's in northeast Minneapolis. I don't think they even make this anymore because I was on the website the other night and it's not one of their offerings. I think it was just a limited release. Solarama Crush.
Wait, where's it out of?
Minneapolis.
It's a really cool can, too. Matter of fact, let me get a picture of this can so that people can see what we're drinking. All right, that's cool. That's big. So, yeah, that's delicious. A couple Fridays ago, or about 10 days ago, Liz Murphy and I from the Naptown Pintcast, we sat down, we went up to 1747. You ever gone up there at Church Circle? It's underneath the...
Oh, yeah, the old...
yeah, it's awesome. Because I'm a Miller Lite guy, as everyone knows. I am white trash as you get. And we took a beer exploration that was actually quite fun. And then afterwards, I went right back to Miller Lite. But I do like this. This is really good.
Bill Muehlhauser, owner of Ram's Head, you know, they have over 100 beers on tap, but he loves Miller Lite.
See, he's my people. Yeah, I'm the same way. I'm not pretentious that way. I'm pretentious in other ways. I'm pretentious in most ways, but not beer. Oh, that's good. All right, so anyway, so your podcast, and actually, so we were telling the story the other day. So Josh calls us up about what? About a year ago, maybe?
Yeah, just over a year ago.
Yeah, and he goes, hey, you guys are podcasting. And we said, thank you very much. And he said, hey, I'm thinking about starting my own. Can I sit back while you edit once? And I said, fine. So Josh comes over to my house. And I sit down, I start lecturing him. I'm like, all right, here's what happens when you compress. And he goes, but when you compress, you bring the bottom up the same as the top. And by about 10 minutes later, he knew more about editing than I did.
No.
You did. actually. You did. Take the compliment. Then you wanted to brainstorm names for the podcast, which is all about renewable energy.
God. Yes.
And I liked Power Trip, which I thought
Yes.
was pretty funny.
Yeah.
But you went with More Power to You, which was probably the sensible choice. I liked the Arrogant Power Trip, which I thought was kind of cool.
Yeah. Oh my God, it was so hard to find a good name.
Yeah, we went back and forth for a long time on that.
Yes.
I like people's projects that don't involve me, and they have to live with it. But
I said, one of mine was like, how about a bundle of energy? And you're like, no.
Well, at first I was trying to be polite. I'm like, let's try and tweak that. In the end, I'm like, no, that's stupid. I hate that. Matter of fact, don't even call me for another day. It's like being locked out of your iPhone. Call me tomorrow. But so I've listened to it, and you know what's kind of interesting to me? So with your podcast is that how young most of the guests are. That it is the guests that you have. It's I don't know if it's a young industry or if it's just the guests you happen to have, but
or maybe just the age bracket we're in now. It's like most people. On Earth,
wait, you know what?
Yeah.
Actually, I'm not even trying to be funny. That just struck me. I'm like, it's young. 50.
Yeah, no, it is true.
That's
I mean,
depressing.
Talk about if you want to go into an industry where you feel like an old person, even in your 40s, go into clean energy, where the pioneers were like. The pioneers from 20 years ago are old men and women in their 50s now.
Right. And that's something I feel like this country, or maybe it's just the political climate, is something that we resist when it comes to energy. It's just something that's seen as kind of out there. It's not something that's realistic. Sure, it'd be nice, but it doesn't meet our needs. And more so, we're seeing, and you're giving me that look. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm saying that's the argument you see coming out of places like, I don't know, the White House.
Right.
Where clean coal is the solution. But I think about Europe, where they've embraced this, and I think they've gone. I think they've taken all the coal plants offline. I think even China's taken their coal plants offline. It's not a market for clean coal anymore.
Some countries have. I mean, some countries. It's interesting because like France is heavy into nuclear, which is carbon free. It's not renewable, quote unquote, but it's carbon free energy.
And it's got inherent risks.
Germany actually closed its nuke plants because of concerns of, it didn't want to use nuclear energy, but it didn't have renewables to offset it. So my understanding is they've actually had to either start up or prolong existing coal plants because they shut down the nuke plants, but that's temporary. Eventually the renewables will get there.
Do you watch Netflix? It's called Occupied. Have you caught that? Oh, dude, that's right up your alley. It takes place in Norway. Season 2 just started.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about it, yeah.
Yeah, so it takes place in Norway, and what happens, the prime minister comes on stage, and he says that they have a new, it's like in the near future, like a year or two down the road, and they said, we have a new form of energy that we are going to share with the world, and we're taking all of our oil platforms offline. And he comes out of that, and all of a sudden this helicopter swoops down, they hustle him in the helicopter, they take him up, and his Secret Service is chasing him, and he's on there, and these guys with Russian accents are like, you're going to fire up those oil platforms again, or you come and get your family, and they sit down, and all of a sudden, there's Russians in the country. It's a soft invasion. So he calls the EU, and he's like, we need help. The Russians have invaded. And they're like, that's too bad. Why don't you fire up those oil platforms again? And it turns out that the EU is part of this, that they want the oil going and everything. And it's a soft invasion of Norway. Wow. It's fantastic. Yeah. It's really, and that's the whole basis, is that they had a renewable energy source, but there was that resistance to that because the immediacy that you have of fossil fuels is going, look, we're equipped for it, we're here, why take our eye off that ball?
Yeah, the geopolitical aspect is interesting. Like in the Obama administration was supporting natural gas exports. And a lot of folks in renewable energy, myself included, think natural gas is not the way to go because a lot of people talk about it as a bridge fuel to transition from coal to full renewable, but natural gas has its own set of problems. But from
what?
Even though natural gas, like a gas-fired power plant, emits a lot less carbon dioxide than a coal-fired power plant, its methane emissions are astronomically higher. So, in some ways, gas is better for the environment. In some ways, natural gas is a whole lot worse even than coal. It's plentiful, it's cheap, and from a geopolitical standpoint, I mean, if we can export natural gas and help reduce the dependence of some of the other countries on Russian gas, for instance, I get that. But just from a renewable energy perspective, natural gas is problematic.
Well, and you go to the geopolitical aspects of that. It was interesting. I think the Tom Clancy book that took place where Islamic extremists blew up some of the oil fields in Siberia, which crippled the Soviet oil production, and so they invaded West Germany and Iceland, and that was the whole premise of the book was, that's Europe's gas station, Russia / the Soviet Union. So our dependence on foreign oil and fossil fuels are what's chaining us to situations in the Middle East and tying us to Russia.
Yeah.
It's not just taking care of the being a curator for the planet, but it also means that we're chained to some unsavory characters.
Exactly. Yeah.
I am not a fan of Saudi Arabia, especially. I think that they're one of the worst regimes around, but they're one of our best friends, and that's because we get 12% of our oil from them, something like that.
And check this out. This tells you, here's a factoid that tells you all you need to know about renewable energy. Saudi Arabia, oil king of the world, is either just has or is in the process of procuring solar development that will be half. If you take all of worldwide solar capacity today, Saudi Arabia is doing one procurement that will be half of all of the total solar capacity worldwide.
So essentially they'd be increasing worldwide solar production by 50%.
Yeah, even though, as of today, but it's going to increase around the rest of the world too. But the point is, even oil countries are like solar, whether it's just to hedge and diversify or whether it's truly because solar is a least cost energy resource, which it is, renewables are going to be here. They are going to dominate. The question is, how do we get there? There's going to be the political pushback, with Trump and wanting to support coal, and you have existing industries, and you have ownership of billions of dollars of existing assets. So that's going to slow down some of the transition, but the transition, regardless of who's president or who's in Congress, is unstoppable because of the economics.
So at what point do we start weaning ourselves off? I know that there's been a huge step forward in the last 10, 15 years where it was just seeing solar, people kind of rolled their eyes in general.
Right.
And now they don't. Now I think that if you look at, we talked about Europe. Europe is someone that's absolutely embraced this. I think in third world countries and countries like Africa, where you're going to see that it's a cheaper way to produce energy for these growing populations. I feel like we're behind the 8 ball as a country when it comes to renewables.
We are. We were in the lead. We were the driving force behind the Paris Accord. We were setting all these major targets as a country.
Even the fuel efficiencies, the situation. The Trump and I'm not picking on the Trump administration politically. I'm saying that they're making some decisions presently. The current administration, whether it be Republican or Democrat, they're making decisions right now that I feel like rolling back the clock on a lot of progress that we've made over the last few years. You get ethanol out of gas, and I'm happy, but that's a different subject. But I think that.
Yeah, we're shirking our leadership role globally, and China is more than happy to step in.
Yeah, and I think we said they've taken, with an argument with coal, they've taken most of their, or at least they've stopped producing new oil-burning facilities. If maybe I'm getting that wrong.
They've put the kibosh on a bunch of new coal plants that were under construction. But, the good news is new renewable energy generation is growing by leaps and bounds. The bad news is it's still not even a majority worldwide. There's still a ton of coal plants and oil burning plants that are being deployed and are running, just because as good as renewables are, fossil fuel plants are also expanding too. We're not at the point yet where renewables are fully displacing fossil plants. We're getting there. But we're at this inflection point now in terms of the economics where the cost of solar has come down, and you mentioned over the past 10 years, 92%.
Wow.
Over the past 10 years. Australia, which is a huge coal exporter, even Australia, there was an article, I think in the Wall Street Journal just in the last few days, how they expect that they may not build another single coal-fired power plant in Australia, which is huge on coal, just because of the economics, again, between solar and wind. And the magic special sauce is going to be battery storage, because the battery storage technology, and a lot of people are familiar with Tesla's Powerwall, as the costs of that continue to decline and production capacity increases and storage capacity increases, that will be the secret sauce, where when the sun's not shining, it's okay, because while the sun was shining, you stored all that energy, so now we can draw it when we need it. Or when the wind's not blowing, that's okay, because we stored all that energy when the wind turbines were spinning, and now we can use it. So when you combine storage with renewables, on a mass scale, that's going to be the true game changer, and it's going to happen. We're almost at this point where we're not going to recognize our energy landscape 10 years from now. Like, it's almost at the point where it's just going to start cascading.
I think batteries that's the next frontier. Everything from electronic devices to power cells, all these things, that's the next frontier is going, we can generate electricity in many different ways, whether it be with fossil fuels or with renewables, but it's the storage of that electricity. That's where it gets tricky.
Yeah.
And I know that's, there's some limitations that they're starting to overcome that is really fascinating. And you see that most obviously in cell phone devices or any electronic devices where now they're lasting a lot longer, they're a lot smaller. They're better for the environment. We're not there yet, obviously. Mm-hmm. There's a long way to go, but it's interesting seeing how fast that's come just in our lifetime.
Yeah.
So it's a year ago when you decide to do a podcast, and you say, all right, what am I most passionate about? And you say, all right, Loch Ness Monster? No. Beer? That's already done by Liz Murphy. So you end up on...
Maryland politics. That's already covered.
Well,
Annapolis politics, Scott McMullen.
MacMullen. But so you ended up with renewable energy. So this is something obviously you're passionate about. But where did it start?
So my last government job, I was an Obama administration appointee at an agency called the Rural Utility Service, which is essentially a huge bank. It finances billions of dollars a year in electricity, telecom, and water and wastewater projects in rural America. It started under FDR as the REA, the Rural Electrification Administration, for folks who know their New Deal programs. And so January 20th last year, Trump takes office. I and several thousand other appointees are out of a job. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm in my 40s. I've been doing politics and government for, my entire professional life. And I may have maybe 20 years, give or take, of professional life in front of me if I'm lucky. And so do I want to just bop around to who will ever hire me, or do I want to be intentional with what I'm doing? And so my work at the Rural Utilities Service, that is what exposed me to the energy transition going on in America. And I was hooked. It's intellectually fascinating, but it also feels good to be doing, to be involved with. And so, I had no particular expertise in it, but I knew that's where I wanted to be. And I was like, well, if Tim and John can do a podcast, how hard can it be?
Yeah, that's been kind of your measurement across the board.
Yeah.
Because I can't even stumble through a sentence, so you can do a podcast.
Yeah, so that's how it started. It's, one, I was just fascinated. I wanted to learn more. Two, I was basically starting from scratch in a brand new industry where I didn't hardly know anybody. And so it's a great networking device, to get my name out there, to meet people, to learn more. And it's been a challenge. It's also fun. And from editing, just the act of putting together an episode and mixing stuff in and modulating the levels and all that stuff in its own way, it's a creative enterprise, and so it's fun to do that.
Well, from a technical side, most people don't know this most of the time, but like when you edit, you're taking out a lot of the stumbles, or there'll be gaps, or it's not pure. Except if we do a political one, we don't touch. Like if someone's running for office, we don't touch that because we don't want to give anyone an advantage. We don't want to make them sound. If they stumble, then we're going to let them stumble. But if we have a guest on, or we have someone, we want it to flow. We want people to hear, But it's funny how oftentimes you're in the middle of editing, you're like, I don't remember talking about this at all, because you're thinking about the next question, and you're trying to extract information from someone, and halfway through you're like, this isn't going as well as I thought, and what's my next question going to be? And all of a sudden there's that awkward pause, and I think that you kind of play that role as kind of the everyman, is because when you're talking to people, and I've heard them, is that you're asking questions not from an insider's point of view, but from a very basic point of view.
You're talking about me?
Yeah,
specifically, yeah.
Yeah, so, you ever get on Reddit and it's ELI5, explain like I'm 5. And for me, with stuff with energy is, I'm the same way that I'm an environmentalist. I'm an environmentalist, but I'm not hardcore, So if someone came in and they could talk about, carbon parts per thousand, or, what plastics do and how they break down, and that's something I'm not equipped to talk about, but I want to learn more about it. I feel that your podcast kind of does the same thing, is because it's a subject that has been kind of relegated to wonks, in the past, where people can, people say, this is the energy of the future. People say, no, it's not economically viable because it doesn't produce, the jobs. And look at Germany where they're being subsidized. And that's where someone like me is like, I give up. I can't wade through all this. And your questions have been somewhat that I'm like, all right, I get this now.
Well, thank
you.
Thank you. It really is like a clean energy 101.
Right.
Because there are excellent energy podcasts out there that are for people who know what they're talking about.
And they tend to get wonky. I mean, that's how it is with everything. It's, when I was doing comedy, it was called Playing to the Back of the Room. And that was that you were telling jokes that the other comics who were sitting back at the bar, they were rolling, but the audience is like, what the hell? Like they weren't following. And I just feel like a lot of subjects like this, when you're talking about renewable energies or environmentalism or, or environmental stewardship, anything, is that those tend to talk to the back of the room, where someone who's really into it is like, oh yeah, I agree. But then, and every man like me is just like, I'm out. But I find with yours that I'm actually getting some of this stuff and stuff that I never understood before, and I'm understanding the economics behind it. Because it's not just, like we said before, it's not just the stewardship of the planet. There's a lot of economics that go along with that.
Right.
That
and policy
and politics and political hotspots in the world. All these things. What happens to the Middle East if all of a sudden you have renewables wipes out their status and their standing and their leverage in the world? What happens to Saudi Arabia? What happens to Russia? What happens to Nigeria? What happens to Venezuela? Well, Venezuela's a lost cause, but but what happens to these countries that the only clout and the only leverage they have right now is oil? The House of Saud has only been in existence since the 1920s. This has been a really short-lived era of prosperity for them. What happens when they lose all that capital? And that's another question.
There's a really interesting podcast series that NPR came out with called Midnight Oil. It's like a 6 or 7 part series about Alaska. It came out a couple years ago, and it's on iTunes.
That's a great example, too.
And it talks about how Alaska, when the state was created, I think in 59 or something, it was a super poor state, and they had not discovered oil on the
up in by the Arctic Circle.
Yeah, they hadn't discovered it, and obviously the discovery of oil changed everything.
Sure, they get a basic income up there. They get checks for like $8,000 a year or something like that. Every resident. It's
a fascinating podcast series because they really do a good job of exploring the point of a compelling narrative, the whole discovery of the oil. And the drama behind whether, they would even find it is really good podcast listening.
It's called Midnight Oil?
Midnight Oil. Mm-hmm. But anyway, to your point.
What happens to Texas?
Well, Texas, anyway, with Alaska, the pipeline is already 10 years past its expected life. And there's a big question about whether it's worth the reinvestment in it, given the environmental issues and given the growth of renewables. Texas is America's leader in wind energy.
Are they really? Well, they're a plain state. I always forget that.
I mean, talk about a resource-rich state with the oil, with the whole West Texas. There's just a ton of wind turbines in that whole corridor. West Texas, I think Oklahoma's number 2, Iowa's number 3 in terms of wind capacity.
For our country, that means that for us, we start producing our own energy, and I think we only import. How much of our oil do we import? I think 12% comes from the Middle East. I know that. And then we got some from Venezuela. We're a large producer. People forget how large a producer that we are.
Yeah.
People say, why are we relying on foreign oil? I'm like, well, we're not relying or dependent on it. It's a part of what we do. But I mean, we're on the road to energy independence. I think the renewables is something that is going to make us, free of a lot of the relationships we have with toxic states, like Saudi Arabia, who I hate. What, you have 40 shows in now, right?
Yeah.
About that?
Having listened to all 40, which is your favorite?
Well, I don't know anyone's names.
I'm just kidding.
It's like watching baseball. I'll watch baseball, but I don't know anyone.
Yeah, so about 10 of my shows, this is like, how do you get access to good events and like build up your audience? Just like, okay, I'm not actually going to interview anyone. I'm just going to plug my XLR cable into the audio feed and just broadcast the event. So about 10 of my shows are just broadcasts of existing events, but I've moved away from that. And, as I've gotten a little more confident myself in my, being able to interview people on a clean energy perspective. So I've done about 30 interview shows. Yeah, and I appreciate your early guidance. I mean, we were kind of laughing about you, like, helping me with my name and everything, but you and Scott McMullen, the two of you, were super helpful and generous with your time and advice, because even though I played in some rock bands in high school, like, podcasting, there's a lot of time that goes into figuring out how to do it well.
Well, it's, I was very lucky in that John handles all the technical aspects as far as like uploading and tagging and, the website for the most part. Like I got to upload one tonight, and it's just such a hassle. It takes me 10 times longer than it takes him. But there, to do a 1 hour podcast or even half-hour podcast, travel time, editing, uploading, the cost of the equipment, the cost of the hosting, and just knowing everything you have to do. I mean, I could put it on to Libsyn, which is what feeds everything.
Right.
But then you have to get it onto Google Play. You have to get it on Stitcher. You have to get it onto Audible and all these different things. And there's no manual out there how to do it. You know, that's why the Maryland podcast thing is so important, because we're able to call other people and say, how do you do this? And people call us, and it has been really cool. It's been a cool community.
It is a cool community. People are super willing to help each other out.
And the interesting thing too is, like we were talking about, so I was listening to yours when you first broadcast, because you want to hear, there's not that many podcasts out there. And if you listen to our early podcasts or Scott's early podcasts and yours, you see such a huge difference between just the first couple episodes and then you listen to the last episode.
Oh my God, yeah.
And it's a great evolution, but you cringe. But you do that with anyone. I listen to Dan Carlin, or I listen to WTF, Mark Maron, and they're so polished and so hardcore right now. But you go back 5-6 years ago, and they were just they started out the same way we did.
Podcasting is great, but it's a humbling exercise.
Yeah.
Because if you are genuinely curious as an interviewer or a host, you are exposing yourself for all of eternity. All your ignorance and all your misconceptions is out there. So you've got to have a certain attitude where you're willing to go in with genuine curiosity, but you're also willing to expose everything you don't know.
When we would interview people politically, and we didn't go out to go into a political podcast. It just kind of evolved. I like the ones where we sit down and drink and we just kind of bullshit, and those are my favorite. But when we interview somebody, and we try and ask, you have that part of the podcast going, are we really journalists, or are we just guys of the podcast?
Right.
I lean kind of towards, we're guys of the podcast, but we follow journalistic ethics. That's where I kind of am with it. So do we have someone who's in front of us? Do we ask the tough questions? And John had John Leopold, and he had to interview him. And is it your responsibility to ask those questions? So the question then is, so we had a fan who's a friend of our podcast, and he after a couple of those podcasts, he kind of text and go, you should have asked this, or why didn't you follow up on that, kind of implying we should have been tougher. And I said, when you're in the moment, you think you're being tough, and then you're editing, you're like, oh my God, I just totally caved on that, or I didn't ask a question, or I didn't follow up, or I let him get away with misrepresenting something that, an answer that they should have. So we had the person on our podcast, and afterwards he goes, all right, that was harder than I thought. I'm like, yeah, because you're in the moment, and you're trying to think of the questions, and you're trying to listen at the same time. So you're not just waiting with your next question. So if they say something, you can follow up on that. And sometimes you do let easy questions go by. And I don't think that's a situation that you would find yourself in, particularly because you're not in a confrontational situation. Right. But you still have to draw out information. So when you're sitting there, you're editing, and you're like, oh my God, he's going off on this subject, and I should have probably steered him in a different direction.
Oh my God.
Or he's in a wonkish place right now, and I should have just jumped in. And there's nothing worse than when you're editing. Well, there's lots of things worse, but when you're editing and one of your guests is rambling, or worse, like what I'm doing now, when I'm rambling. When
the host, or like I go out. So like this beer one.
And we get that a lot, by the way. People criticize us for that.
I love it. I love yours. I mean, partly it's because I know some of the people in the places you're talking about.
We play to the back of the room a lot.
Right. You do. And I love your humor. I love your asides.
John does not.
I know he doesn't.
He does not appreciate
it. I love it. But, so for example, this Solarama Crush beer we're drinking was from this episode. It was my episode number 40 about pollinator-friendly habitat. It takes me 10 minutes to get to pollinator-friendly habitat. Right. And so I'm listening to it. It was a good interview. It was... I thought it was interesting. I learned a lot. But I'm like, oh, my God, I'm 40 episodes into this, and still, like, it takes forever. So if I'm just, like, searching hashtags or whatever on iTunes, and I'm like, pollinator friendly, as if anyone's searching for that, and I'm like, oh, great, here's a podcast episode about pollinator friendly solar.
You start listening.
And then I'm talking about Minnesota and, like, wind energy in Minnesota. It's like...
But I listen to Joe. I listen to a ton of podcasts. I don't listen to anything but podcasts, and I like people who kind of flow, and that's why I love Joe Rogan. Is that he goes 3 hours and then he can just ramble, and I like going on that journey with him. I just really enjoy that. And there are people who are rigid, and they leave you wanting more. But sometimes I just want to eat the whole bag of circus peanuts. I don't want to just have a couple, And Joe Rogan's like that, and I really enjoy it. But sometimes it takes you a while to get there and to warm up. Or if you find something more interesting, you're like, that's more interesting, let's go off on that. But like we were just saying, there's nothing worse when you're editing and you have those tracks, and there's my track, and there's all those little squiggles. And I'm like, oh my God, I went on for 20 minutes, that's that. And you feel, I'll cut it out, I'll cut it down. But
well, you're naturally conversational. Yeah, I mean, like it's okay. And like I said, I enjoy listening to you because like you vocalize what you're thinking and there's like a trajectory to it and you can follow along. So it works with you. So I wouldn't be too hard on yourself.
No, and if I may return the compliment, because that's what we're doing right here over beer, and this beer is good.
It is. I'm not even an IPA guy, but this
I'm not
is a
either,
good beer.
and this is really good. But I like that you're very analytical, and I like people who are analytical. Jared Littman certainly is that way. I like people who have clarity of thought, which I don't have, and I envy that. That's why I go off on tangents. But I like people who can look at an issue, and to them it's crystal clear, and they can break that down in a linear manner. And I feel like when I'm listening to these, and don't get me wrong, the first time I was going to listen, I was doing it kind of as a favor, just because I'm like, I'm not into this and that. But then I'm like, I really do enjoy this because you're able to kind of break it down.
Good.
And you're able to categorize it, and you're able to clarify it. So there was no stumbling and no periods where you were lost and you're getting lost in the weeds. And I'm just like, I don't know what's going on. But you've gotten a lot better with your guests.
Thanks. Some of the best advice I got was I was talking to a guy named Nico Johnson who has an energy podcast called Suncast. And he reached out to me. He's a huge networker. And so we ended up talking. We ended up talking for 90 minutes. And so he asked me, he said, who's your avatar? And I had no idea what he meant. And he's like, who is the listener that your podcast is for?
Yeah, that's an old program director's trick. You have to put the picture of the person that you find in a magazine and talk to that person. That's right. In radio.
And for him, it's like a young solar entrepreneur who's hustling and trying to figure out how to make it work in the solar business. And I was like, I don't know, like someone interested in clean energy. But so that was and that shows you how novice I was, but that's got to be one of the first questions you answer if you're going to do your own podcast is, who is my target audience who's going to listen to this and think, wow, they did this podcast just for me because it's speaking directly to me. And Nico's point was, you don't want to be, you don't want to be a mile wide and an inch deep. You want to just own that one little piece of ground.
Exactly. And I think that, so there's this comic that I like, and I was listening to him on someone else's podcast, and he has his own podcast, but he was talking about the age that we live in now. And I teach a university course every other semester, and I ask the students, I said, what do you want to do with your degree? And everyone says, I want to work in marketing, or I want to do this. I said, not one of you has said you want to start your own business. 5 of you said you want to be in radio. Start your own podcast. I don't believe in paying your dues. I don't believe in it. I believe that if you're talented and you're smart, you can build a better widget, that you can make your own way. I don't believe in occupying space for a certain amount of time until it's deemed that you've qualified to move forward in your industry. I hate that concept. Mm-hmm. And what this comic was saying is that, if you are in comedy and you're waiting for opportunities to come to you, you're waiting for, people to offer you things, he goes, you're wasting your time. He goes, if you want to be on radio, have a podcast. If you want to have a comedy special, put it out on your website and distribute it on your own. He goes, we have the tools right now that we can reach the people we want to reach without that middleman. And I'm thinking with podcasts too, is that I've been listening to podcasts for like 15 years. I love them. I think they're great. And they've just exploded over the last probably 2 or 3. And they're not even quite mainstream yet, but they're getting there. My mom's starting to listen to them, and that means it's getting mainstream. But when people tell you about the rules of podcasting, it's bullshit. So I'm a firm believer in the hour-long in-depth interview, because you don't get traction until you warm up at a certain point. There have been some exceptions to that, and which is fine.
Or a crab cake. I mean, your crab cakes are good.
Yeah, but you have to be able to hit the ground running. You know, so that's what you have to understand. Like you said, is who am I trying to reach? And with us, we're local. So we know that we reach like the political class, the people who are elected officials, their employees, the people who work and live within politics. They tend to follow us somewhat. We're a small town, so I'd like to be more Maryland oriented, but we've kind of fallen into that Annapolis and Anne Arundel sort of situation just because the contacts we have and the fan base we have. But like Nico said, is that if everything I just said is that you make your own opportunities and you have the tools to do these things, you still have to have a focus and a vision. You still have to want to make sure that, all right, is the quality good? Am I better at this episode than I was in the last episode? And what can I do to make myself better? And I get frustrated when I hear podcasts that are interesting, but the quality sucks. We the People Live with Josh Zepps. It's a fantastic podcast. He's an Australian. He's got a great take on American culture, but the quality is kind of lousy. Generation Y, they do a true crime podcast, and they're very popular. But sometimes I'm just like, can you just work on the quality? Those are the things you can control. So you just control the things you can. And when you have guests on, you're in charge of the guest, and that becomes incumbent upon you going, I have to guide them. I have to extract the information out of them that my avatar is going to find interesting. And that's a difficult charge sometimes. And sometimes you hit the mark, and sometimes you don't.
Yeah, I didn't realize how much time goes into doing a podcast before you even press record.
Right.
I mean, to have a good interview, to sit down, the guest is like, okay, I have half an hour or an hour or however long it is. You need to know what you're talking about and have a clear sense of, like you're saying, not that you are going to have the podcast pre-scripted in your head, but you're going to want to have a clear sense ahead of time, and that means doing the research. It takes a lot of time.
Yeah, and it's also, it doesn't end up where you want it to be sometimes. Sometimes in the middle of the interview, you're like, sometimes you're like, this sucks, and you get the editing, you're like, no, it doesn't. It's actually pretty good. And sometimes you're like, this sucks, and you're right. And it's no one's fault. It's just the energy level or whatever it is. Or you turn on the mics, and right before you're having the conversation, you're like, all right, we're going to talk about this, and they're like, fine. And you're like, all right, welcome to the show. And they're like, thank you very much for having me. Like, oh, shit. Yes. They've gone into radio mode, and that's...
I was talking to one podcast. I was interviewing someone from I was interviewing a guest.
Yeah, I do that too. And, this person...
So I start out a lot of podcasts with, okay, before we talk about the subject matter, tell me about your company or your organization. Like, what is it? What does it do? And so he just starts reading this paper. And so I have to cut him off like 2 minutes into it. I'm like, we got to start from scratch. You just... Don't look at the paper, look at me. Because it sounded like if I was listening to it, I would have fallen asleep after minute one.
It's controlling the guest. I love, do you ever listen to WTF with
No,
Mark
you told me about it since I started
He is the best interviewer, hands down. He can, I always say he had what was his name who played the Fonz?
Henry Winkler.
He had Henry Winkler on, and they didn't talk about the Fonz once. He had Alan Alda once and they talked about MASH for like a minute. I just, that to me, he gets to places that he's asking questions that you just never thought that you'd be talking about. You're like, well, I kind of want to get the MASH stuff. And then halfway through, you're like, tell me more about his father and how his father abandoned them. And it's fascinating stuff. And that sometimes you get with a guest, you find out they're more interesting on a level that's different than when you brought them on. I'll tell you, I screwed that up before that. Wes Adams, our state's attorney.
Yeah.
He was a fascinating guy because he was talking about why
that was a good interview.
He was passionate about addiction, and and his brother-in-law, he was talking about that openly, and then tragically his brother-in-law died a week later, and that interview went a different way than I thought it was going to go. We've had people on before that you think it's going to get kind of clinical, and it's just it's really a lot of fun because some people just get it. Some people we're here to just kind of talk, have fun. Sean O'Neill's like that. He's like, oh, we're gonna sit back and we're kind of bullshit. And we called him out on a couple things. When it came with like merging the chamber,
right?
And Alex Pline, because he and I have gotten into it on Facebook on the Obnoxious Biker. So it's great getting someone on there where you can argue openly and it's fun.
Those were great episodes. I mean, you have to like be a little bit of a policy wonk and know Annapolis, but those were great episodes.
Right, and Alex is someone that you have to edit heavily. That was 5 hours to edit because Alex is where I go off, I interrupt myself like I just did. I'll start something and I'll interrupt myself and go. He's worse than I am, so it took me 5 hours between me and him to edit that into some sort of cohesive sort of thing. And like you said, you have to be a policy wonk, and you want to get to a point where you're like, we want to be everything to everybody. But sometimes with some of these guests, you're going to go to the back of the room and go, all right, we're only going to have 100 listeners, but the ones we have are going to really enjoy this episode.
And that was interesting. Alex's episode, or at least one of them, I remember because I don't remember if it was you or John, but you guys started with a certain perspective on parking. And Alex had a very different perspective.
Schooled us.
Yeah. And so, I mean, just listening to it, like the listener was along for the ride as your thinking evolved.
Right.
Yeah.
And you have to be open to that. That's what I found out too. We were talking about this before the podcast. I was talking about arguing online and just how you're kind of set with going in. And there's very few people who would say, you know what, you've given me something to think about. I'm trying to be better about that. If someone's got a perspective, especially when it comes to something like parking. We're like, there's no parking downtown. And then someone goes, no, actually there is, and here's why. You have to be open to that.
Yeah.
And when you have these guests who come on who can kind of educate you onto something that you disagree with. And that's the other complaint that we do have is that people say, we'd like to see more people who disagree with you. And I agree with that. I'd like to see more with that.
I disagree with that.
You're wrong. But I mean, it's fun when you have someone that you can have a conversation with. Who's your guest that you had the best conversation with? Like, that you're in it and you're like, this is a lot of fun.
Wow.
Not to say they're all not great, and they are.
No.
But there's someone that you're like, they totally get this format. They're a lot of fun.
So within my sphere of clean energy policy, I don't want to necessarily say he's the best, but Tanuj Diora is a guy who's with SEPA. It's an NGO called the Smart Electric Power Alliance based in D.C., and he was like an advisor to a previous Colorado governor on energy. And so he understands like the policy, like the nuts and bolts of energy, but he also understands how to translate it into a political discussion, which is it's hard to have both of those talents. So I did a couple episodes where I interviewed someone at SEPA. One was on energy storage. One was on envisioning if we were to like rebuild our entire electric grid from the ground up, what would it look like? And so I interviewed 2 people each time, and he was one of them. And he articulates complicated energy concepts as clearly as anyone I've ever heard.
When you get people who are able to break it down and they understand the concept, they understand what you're trying to get to, it makes it so much easier. And it gets to the point that you're talking to them and you're like, holy crap, we've been talking for hours about this, and I could go on.
Yeah.
Like right now, because our crab cake is now at 50 minutes.
That is a jumbo crab cake.
It's going to be a jumbo crab cake. And you know what? I'm not touching it. I'm leaving it the same size. This is what happened with me with Liz Murphy. So you have a great podcast, my friend. I really do enjoy it.
Thank you so much.
I like the fact that it's high quality. You have great guests. You're able to break down complex issues in something that's even someone as simple as me can understand. I want you to keep doing it. And for everyone else out there, continue with the Maryland Podcast Month. And our friends at Red Maryland started this, and so that's more power to you. Maryland Crabs, Naptown Pintcast, the Annapolis Podcast, and there's a bunch more out there. Liz Musur, she's Ms. Maryland, I think.
I think so.
She's got a great high-quality one. But follow all the local
Heather
guys,
Musur,
Heather, and rate 5 stars plus and give the reviews because it helps everyone out. Josh, this was awesome. Thank you for my beer, for Solarama Crush.
Yeah.
I don't have my glasses.
Tim, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
This is awesome.
This is fun.
Let's keep drinking.
Yes.
This has been the Maryland Crabs Podcast with Tim Hamilton and John Fernay. Sure to follow them in all the regular places, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and online at themarylandcrabs.com. Take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Now, get the hell out of my kitchen. Seriously, go!
You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.